Cannabis stocks dipped yesterday. However, investors remain optimistic on the heels of 420. The marijuana industry is expected to grow to double its value by 2025. Canada became the second country in the world to legalize cannabis on October 17, 2018. Recreational cannabis is also legal in 18 states in the U.S. So what does this growing market mean for investors? Well, joining us now to give us more insight into cannabis stocks is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Ltd. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon, Nima. Thanks for having me.
Now, Brendan, yesterday was 420, so that's a day that's been connected to cannabis culture for decades. But what does this day mean for investors?
Well, I think the original meeting came out of some school, probably in California, where the kids all got together after school at 420 to smoke up. So the date became synonymous with the time, and there we are. Obviously, cannabis has been a big deal in Canada from both a legalization point of view. As you pointed out, we're one of the leading countries in the world for making what millions of people were doing legal anyway. And also from an investor point of view, we are, I believe, the leading country in the world for public cannabis companies. There was a huge interest in these, as there often is when the market first comes to existence. But cannabis obeys the law of economics like anything else, in that eventually there's not going to be hundreds and hundreds of cannabis companies. There will be a consolidation, both because some companies succeed, some go out of business, and also with consolidation. So it might be that this, if I hesitate to use the term second wave, but after the initial flush of enthusiasm and then the falling off from the high, you've seen a bit of a resurgence here, second wind, if you will, and cannabis is getting a little bit more of a puff.
All right, Brendan. Well, I do know that you're on the board of the Canadian Securities Exchange. Now, that was at the forefront dealing with Canadian cannabis companies. So tell us a little bit more about your personal experience dealing with the cannabis industry.
Well, one of my kids joked with me when we were discussing this just yesterday that she wasn't even sure that if I knew what color cannabis was. So my personal experience is somewhat limited. With the Canadian Securities Exchange, actually very interesting. It is quite a bit like the technology sector was for NASDAQ 40 years ago. The NYSE turned up its nose, the New York Stock Exchange, that is, turned up its nose at technology stocks because they didn't have plant and equipment. They just had people and this thing called software. So they wouldn't list, and NASDAQ came into existence because of the software industry. So the Canadian Securities Exchange has been around for 18 years. It just needed an industry that it could do that nobody else could. And the Toronto Stock Exchange wouldn't list cannabis companies with exposure in the US, because you pointed out, while 18 states have legalized cannabis, it's still federally illegal in the US. So for various reasons, TSX wouldn't list those companies. So all the scores of cannabis companies, hundreds indeed of cannabis companies that wanted to become public, they needed a venue, and that was the Canadian Securities Exchange. And we've been a full part of the up and down, but when this exchange got started 18 years ago, or we came into it about 10 years ago, yes, we just needed industry. Didn't dream in 1,000 years that it would be pot.
All right, Brendan. So I guess the big question here would be, is cannabis a good investment for our investors in Canada?
Well, I think what you've seen when you've had the first flush and then now this sorting out the industry, one needs to look at this like any other industry. There's nothing special from an economic perspective about cannabis. It's company by company within the sector, and those that are able to generate sales, grow their business, have earnings, and because it's a regulated business, as we've seen, not run afoul of the regulatory authorities, because Canada is cutting edge. We can't afford to be offside. So those companies that can do that may end up being, in fact, good investments. My own preference is I can see the medical uses for cannabis. Never been a big fan of the recreational uses, but this and the next wave will actually be psychedelics, where the ability of those to treat symptoms of PTSD and other mental illness issues can be tremendous. So the medical uses, I think, still have tremendous potential from both areas, both sectors.
All right. Always an interesting and informative conversation, Brendan. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Nima. Be well.